They say a city only truly dies when its stories fade, but Detroit? Detroit hides a story so haunting it practically grips your collar and whispers, "Look closer." Because behind the cracked windows and collapsing roofs of its forgotten mansions, there's a silence so heavy you can almost feel the echoes of a world that once believed it could never fall. And maybe that's the part that gets me every time. These places weren't just homes. They were declarations. They were proof that an empire had been built, that fortunes here would last forever. Except they didn't. And the strangest thing is how fast forever can disappear. Imagine gliding down a boulevard so wealthy that neighbors casually called it Millionaire's Row without irony. Streetcars humming in the distance, marble staircases visible through tall windows, carriages rolling past columns that looked like they belonged on an estate in Florence rather than the middle of America. People strolled here the way you might wander through a luxury district, not rushing, just soaking up the glow of a city that believed it was unstoppable. That's the part of the story that almost feels fictional now. Because if you stand on that same boulevard today, you'd swear you'd stepped into another reality entirely. Same street, same houses, but the shift is so violent, it doesn't feel like decay, it feels like a warning. One of the first things you notice when you begin to unravel the history of these mansions is how quickly Detroit transformed from a frontier outpost into the capital of American industry. It's wild how compressed that timeline really was. A few decades, and suddenly you had men whose wealth outpaced their imagination. Lumber barons, merchants, then of course the titans of the automobile age, Ford, Dodge, Fisher, and a whole cast of characters people don't talk about anymore, but whose fingerprints remain all over the bones of these homes. They didn't just build big houses, they built monuments to themselves, to their optimism, to the idea that Detroit's golden age would stretch on indefinitely. But if there's one thread that keeps tugging at this story, it's the tension between ambition and reality. Because even at their peak, these mansions existed in a city that was expanding so fast it almost outran its own shadow. Those early millionaires couldn't guess that their grand boulevard would eventually become a relic, or that their legacy would end up being photographed mostly by urban explorers who had to wear masks to avoid inhaling mold. It's almost poetic, if you're into that kind of irony, but honestly it feels more tragic than anything. This wasn't just the fall of individual homes. It was the unraveling of a belief system. Picture the interior of one of these houses during its prime, a ballroom flickering with electric light at a time when the technology was still new enough to impress guests. A dining room paneled in dark wood imported from places most Americans would never see in their lifetime. Servants moving like shadows, orchestras tuning up before a gala, the smell of cigar smoke and perfume weaving together in the air. These moments weren't rare, they were routine. And the owners walked through all of it with the certainty that their success was permanent, as if their prosperity had been baked into the foundation. And then, slowly at first, the foundation began to crack, not literally, not yet, but socially, economically, culturally. Cities don't collapse overnight, they erode. And the erosion of this neighborhood didn't start with a single event. It was more like a series of dominoes falling in slow motion, changing transportation patterns, shifting demographics, industrial restructuring, the rise of the suburbs pulling people toward new neighborhoods that promised cleaner air, quieter streets, and none of the growing congestion and complexity of the inner city. Millionaire's Row wasn't abandoned instantly. It was abandoned gradually, subtly, almost politely. That's what makes it so haunting. Nobody intended to leave it behind. It simply happened. What really chills me is how the mansions themselves became mirrors for what was happening to Detroit at large. First came the small indignities, paint peeling, gardens going wild, the occasional boarded-up window. Then the big ones, entire families moving out, sections of the boulevard falling silent, properties sitting unclaimed. Some houses became apartments, then tenements, then hazards. A few were maintained for a while, like stubborn holdouts refusing to surrender. But entropy is patient. These buildings were built to withstand time, but not neglect. And time always works faster once neglect sets in. There's a moment in every abandoned mansion where the past becomes too loud to ignore. For some houses, it's the staircase that still looks elegant, even while sagging under its own weight. For others, it's the fresco that refuses to fade, clinging to the wall even as the plaster surrounding it crumbles. And then there are the fireplaces, dozens of them, carved with incredible detail, sitting cold and sooty like the last survivors of a forgotten war. It's strange how something so beautiful can also feel accusatory. Like the house is asking, how did you let this happen? But to understand how it happened, you have to look beyond the walls. Detroit's story is tangled with forces bigger than any one neighborhood. The same engines that made it rich eventually choked it. Globalization redirected manufacturing. Automation reduced the need for workers. Economic crises hit harder here than in most places, and when people lose stability, they move. Wealth follows new opportunities, and once wealthy avenues turn into memories. The mansions didn't collapse because they were weak. They collapsed because everything supporting them, economically, socially, emotionally, shifted. What's strangely powerful about this history is how it refuses to stay in the past. You can walk along those same streets today and see fragments of the old Detroit peeking through, almost like the houses are trying to tell you their side of the story. And it's not just sadness. There's pride in those ruins. There's defiance. There's the faint outline of a city that once roared so loudly that the world had to listen. And maybe that's why the story hits so hard. Because these mansions weren't just passive victims of time. They were symbols of a dream that burned too brightly, too confidently. A dream that believed prosperity was a straight line instead of a cycle. A dream that built itself in stone and wood and marble, without realizing that no material is strong enough to resist the collapse of an entire ecosystem around it. And now, standing in the wreckage, you can't help but feel the weight of what was lost. Not just the architecture, but the spirit sewn into every inch of it. People sometimes ask why these houses weren't saved sooner, or why the city didn't step in, or why preservationists didn't rally in time. But it's never that simple. When decline marches in, it tends to swallow everything at once. Money dries up, infrastructure falls apart, priorities shift to survival, and old houses, no matter how grand, become burdens. That's the part no one likes to admit, but it's true. Preserving history requires stability, and Detroit didn't have that luxury for a long time. Even now, some of these mansions cling to life. A few have been restored, a few are being stabilized, and a few stubbornly stand in limbo, too damaged to repair easily, too significant to demolish without regret. And walking past them, you can almost feel the tension between what they were and what they've become. It's not just decay, it's contradiction, a kind of architectural ghost suspended between pride and ruin. And as you trace that contradiction, you start to see the outlines of something larger, something almost unsettling in how familiar it feels, even if you've never been to Detroit. Because every empire, no matter how powerful, leaves behind these kinds of ruins. They're warnings carved into the landscape, reminders that nothing stays golden forever, no matter how fiercely people try to hold on to it. And Detroit's Millionaire's Row might just be one of the clearest, most dramatic examples of that truth. Now, if you keep following the timeline, and especially if you pay attention to the way these houses intersected with social shifts like migration, redlining, and industrial collapse, a whole new layer to the story starts to unfold. But before reaching that point, it's worth pausing on something easy to overlook. Because beneath the dramatic rise and fall, there's a quieter human thread woven through every room of these mansions, a thread most people never think about. It's the everyday lives that played out between the grandeur. The laughter spilling down staircases during family dinners, the arguments whispered behind heavy oak doors, the birthdays, the grief, the ambitions, the secrets. These houses weren't just symbols, they were ecosystems of emotion. And when you understand that, the ruins stop being just architecture. They become personal. They start to feel like abandoned memories that someone simply never came back for. Take a moment and picture the people who didn't appear in the headlines, the cooks who kept the kitchens humming, the chauffeurs polishing sleek cars in the carriage houses out back, the housekeepers making sure the chandeliers sparkled for another night of entertaining. They watched this boulevard shift in real time. They saw the first glimpses of decline long before the owners did. Because it's always the people closest to the ground who notice the small changes, one wing of the house used less often, one gardener let go, one bill ignored, one repair postponed. The fall doesn't happen all at once. It starts with little fractures that only show themselves to those living in the margins of luxury. As the decades rolled on, the once solid identities of these families began to blur. The children who grew up here didn't always want to maintain the enormous estates. Some left the city entirely. Others were pulled toward new neighborhoods that promised modern convenience over old-world charm. And while those choices made sense individually, Collectively, they created a slow vacuum along the boulevard. Empty rooms turned into empty houses. Empty houses turned into opportunities for buyers with very different intentions. Some tried to preserve the original character, but many carved these mansions into multifamily units or boarding houses, each renovation stripping away one more layer of the past. And then came the seismic shift that jolted Detroit more violently than anything before, the massive demographic changes of the mid-20th century. While the auto industry boomed, tensions simmered beneath the surface, tensions about space, opportunity, race, and power. Policies like redlining didn't just reshape neighborhoods, they reshaped destinies. Millionaire's Row found itself caught in a storm of decisions made far beyond its borders. As lending dried up and certain areas became isolated from resources, the value of these mansions plummeted, even if the structures themselves were still magnificent. In a different world, maybe they would have survived, but in this one, they were swept into the undertow of forces too big to resist. What's wild is how fast decay accelerates once an area reaches a certain tipping point. When a neighborhood no longer feels stable, investment evaporates, basic maintenance becomes rare, people move out faster than they move in. And the houses, these incredible, overbuilt, opulent mansions, were simply not designed to be ignored. They needed care, money, constant attention. Without it, time becomes aggressive, roofs fail, water seeps in. Mold climbs the walls, vines tear through foundations as if nature is reclaiming something it never agreed to give up. It's almost unsettling how quickly a masterpiece can collapse if no one is there to fight the slow hunger of neglect. But here's the strange twist. Even as decline took over, the bones of these houses remained stubbornly elegant. Explorers who wander through today often describe the experience as standing inside a time capsule with both its clock and its heartbeat broken. Beneath the dust and rot, you still catch glimpses of craftsmanship that almost seems impossible now. Carved mantels untouched for decades, stained glass windows still glowing faintly even without sunlight. Floors that were once polished to perfection, now creaking, but unmistakably dignified. It's as if the houses themselves refused to forget who they were. And yet, every once in a while, among the decay, you find signs of resilience, not in the structures, but in the people who still live around them. Neighbors who grew up here when the boulevard was already fading, but still remember bits of its glory. Community elders who tell stories of walking past these mansions as children, imagining the lives inside and wondering how anyone could ever leave such beauty behind. Those stories are important because they reveal something deeper. Even when the houses lost their owners, they didn't lose their impact. If you listen closely to those stories, you'll notice something interesting. People rarely describe the mansions as sad. They describe them as stubborn, proud, enduring. There's almost a sense of personality attributed to them, and maybe that's not surprising. When architecture becomes this grand, it stops being just structure and starts being something closer to identity, a city's reflection of itself. And when that identity shatters, the fragments don't just disappear, they linger. Detroit reached a point where those fragments felt heavy. The city was dealing with crime, unemployment, population decline, and political turmoil. Saving historic mansions wasn't at the top of anyone's agenda, and honestly, it couldn't be. People were trying to survive. They were trying to hold on to the pieces of their lives that mattered the most. And while the boulevard crumbled, other neighborhoods fought to stay afloat, schools struggled to stay open, and businesses tried to weather storm after storm. It wasn't a lack of appreciation, it was a lack of bandwidth. But even as everything spiraled, hope never disappeared entirely. Detroit is one of those cities that refuses to stay quiet. There's a certain grit baked into the DNA of the place, a kind of resilience that shows up in the harshest moments. And eventually, after years of decline, the possibility of resurgence started to flicker. Not strongly, not universally, but enough to remind people that the city still had a pulse. And as new energy began circulating in parts of Detroit, eyes slowly drifted. Back to the forgotten mansions. Questions resurfaced. Could these homes be saved? Should they be saved? What would it take? The reality is complicated. Restoring a single mansion can cost more than building a modern house from scratch. The infrastructure around them often needs just as much help as the buildings themselves. And even if you pour millions into revival, there's no guarantee the surrounding neighborhood will support the change. History isn't just about what once stood. It's about finding a future that gives that history meaning again. And that's where the story of Millionaire's Row becomes more than a tale of decline. It becomes a conversation about memory, value, and what a city chooses to carry forward. Because the truth is, not every historic building can be saved. Some will vanish no matter how much we care. Others will be rescued by the passion of individuals or organizations determined to protect what's left. And some will stay suspended in that strange middle ground, deteriorating but still standing, daring time to knock them down completely. But before you jump ahead and imagine what the boulevard might look like decades from now, there's an important layer of this story that reveals why these houses didn't just decline, they transformed the moment migration patterns reshaped the heart of Detroit. And once you understand that shift, the entire narrative of these mansions takes on a different color altogether, almost as if the buildings themselves were reacting to the changing currents swirling around them. Because the truth is, a mansion doesn't fall into ruin simply because its owners leave. It falls when the world around it shifts so dramatically that the ground beneath it becomes unfamiliar. And that's exactly what happened as Detroit became the destination for one of the largest internal migrations in American history. Hundreds of thousands of people, many fleeing the Jim Crow South, arrived seeking the same thing the original millionaires once chased: opportunity. Except they weren't greeted with open doors, they were met with boundaries, literal and invisible. As neighborhoods absorbed these newcomers, Millionaire's Row found itself at the intersection of fear, policy, and rapid change. Restrictive covenants made certain areas off-limits. Banks refused to lend in neighborhoods they labeled high risk, even when the only risk was the color of the residents, and the irony is almost painful. The same city built on innovation trapped itself in an outdated worldview that corroded its own foundation from within. These mansions, once symbols of progress, became unintended casualties of a system determined to resist it. And when that resistance met the realities of population shifts, the perfect storm formed. Wealth fled first, not out of malice, but out of habit, out of fear, out of the belief that safety and prestige now lived elsewhere. Suburbs rose like fresh promises, whispering easier living, greener lawns, better schools. The owners of these grand boulevards listened. They packed up, not because they despised the city, but because the momentum of society was pulling them away like a current too strong to swim against. Left behind were communities trying to build a life inside houses that were never designed for modest living. Imagine taking a mansion and dividing it into small apartments. Suddenly, a home meant for one wealthy family and a dozen servants had to function as shelter for 4 or 5 families. Plumbing strained, electrical systems outdated by half a century buckled. Maintenance became expensive, and landlords who lacked resources cut corners. What was once polished elegance turned into a patchwork of temporary fixes. The mansions didn't just lose wealth, they lost purpose. The people moving in weren't trying to preserve history, they were trying to survive. And there's nothing villainous about that. Survival always comes first. But survival rarely includes refinishing woodwork or repairing stained glass windows. So, ceilings sagged, roofs leaked, basements flooded, and no one had the luxury to slow it down. Then, Detroit faced one blow after another: industrial restructuring, job losses, factories shutting down or moving overseas, entire neighborhoods hollowed out. What little investment remained became concentrated in small pockets, while so many streets were left to weather the storm alone. Millionaire's Row, once the pinnacle of stability, became a symbol of slow-motion collapse. The houses were too large to maintain, too expensive to restore, too damaged to attract buyers, and too full of potential for anyone to feel comfortable tearing them down. And yet, despite everything, the identity of the boulevard didn't disappear. The presence of the mansions lingered like a kind of architectural gravity. Even stripped of their grandeur, their massive frames dominated the streetscape. You could see one from a block away, towering over everything nearby, a ghost that refused to fade into the background. And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because even in ruin, these houses demanded to be acknowledged. Urban explorers began wandering in with flashlights and cameras, fascinated by the tension between what was and what remained. The photos they took went viral, attracting not just curiosity but questions. Who lived here? What happened? How did something so magnificent end up forgotten? And while it's easy to criticize these visitors for romanticizing decay, their images did something important. They forced people to look again, to see the city not as a lost cause, but as a place with layers worth understanding. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that this isn't just a Detroit story. It's a human pattern. Societies build big when confidence is high, then retreat when tides shift. If the original owners could see their mansions now, they'd probably say it feels impossible that such a downfall could happen in one lifetime. Yet it did. And that's what makes these places powerful. They force you to confront the fragility of prosperity. Still, the narrative doesn't end with ruin. It never does with cities like Detroit. Even in the darkest chapters, there were always people trying to hold things together, local historians documenting everything they could, community members organizing cleanups, activists fighting redlining and promoting reinvestment long before revitalization became a trend. These efforts might have seemed small, but together they were like threads stitching torn fabric, preventing complete unraveling. And slowly, unbelievably slowly, the city began to shift again. Not back to what it was because that era is gone forever, but towards something new. Fresh generations started seeing beauty in the old architecture. Developers with vision and sometimes with stubborn optimism began testing whether restoration was still possible. A few mansions were saved, a few more found new owners willing to try. Others remained stuck in limbo, waiting for someone brave enough to take on their history. The thing is, reviving a mansion isn't just a construction project. It's like trying to wake a sleeping giant without breaking its bones. You have to honor what it was, accommodate what it is, and imagine what it could become. And that's a complicated dance, especially when each house tells a different story, suffers from different wounds, and holds different secrets beneath the dust. But before exploring those attempts at revival, and the surprising directions some of these houses have taken, it's worth stepping inside the lives of the original residents, because the decisions that built these mansions, the ambitions that shaped them, and the rivalries that fueled their extravagance form a whole other side of the story, one that reveals just how intensely people invested their identities into these walls. And you can almost feel that intensity when you start tracing the people behind these estates, because the families who built these homes weren't just wealthy. They were pivotal characters in the drama that shaped Detroit's rise. Some were titans of the auto industry, others made fortunes in lumber, shipping, railroads, or retail. Their names appeared in newspapers, etched into the stone of public buildings, written on the donation plaques of libraries and museums. Their houses were the physical translation of their ambitions, and you can't really understand the boulevard without stepping into the mindset that created it. Imagine being one of these early industrial powerhouses at a time when Detroit's growth felt limitless. You're not just building a house, you're declaring your place in the hierarchy of a city exploding with wealth. Every decision becomes a flex. Marble imported from Italy, decorative ironwork commissioned from artisans in New York, roof tiles chosen because they matched the latest Parisian trends. These people weren't modest about their success. They wanted you to see it the moment you turned onto the boulevard. But beneath all the display, there was a quiet competitiveness threading through the neighborhood. If one family hosted an extravagant ball, another would respond with a bigger one. If someone added a new wing to their house, another family might renovate their entire facade. Status wasn't just earned, it was curated. And this pressure created homes that felt like they were constantly trying to outdo one another. Which is part of why the ruins still feel so theatrical today. They weren't built for simplicity, they were built to impress. Yet, despite all their wealth, the people inside these houses weren't immune to the same challenges that ripple through any era. Financial downturns hit, family disputes fractured fortunes, some heirs lacked the discipline of their parents, others lacked the interest. Imagine inheriting a mansion at 25 when all you really want is a smaller place or a life that doesn't involve maintaining a property the size of a small museum. The responsibility didn't always match the desire, and the cracks in the dynasty often began from within. And then there were the secrets, affairs concealed behind closed curtains, bitter rivalries played out in lawsuits, the kind of scandals that were whispered about in newspapers with just enough detail to fuel gossip, but not enough to ruin reputations. These homes carried those stories in their walls, the way old wood carries the memory of every footstep. And even now, when you walk through a ruined ballroom with paint curling off the ceiling, you can almost feel those tensions lingering like static. One of the more fascinating parts of this history is how many families weren't prepared for what Detroit's rapid transformation demanded of them. Wealthy life in the early 1900s required a kind of permanence, long-term staff, years of planning, estates maintained across decades. But Detroit didn't move slowly. The automobile age accelerated everything, and what felt secure in one decade could become outdated in the next. Some families adapted, many didn't. And as their fortunes shifted, the upkeep of these enormous homes became harder to justify. There were also families whose wealth never disappeared, but their priorities changed. As the suburbs developed, status migrated. Suddenly, a mansion on the boulevard didn't represent success, it represented attachment to a fading era. And wealthy families love momentum. They don't stay where the prestige used to be, they go where it's headed. The exodus wasn't a rejection of the city, it was a chase for the next badge of success. But if you take a step back, what happened to these families mirrors what happened to Detroit itself. A meteoric rise fueled by innovation, followed by a collision with realities no one planned for. When you build your world on forward motion, it's easy to forget how quickly the environment can shift under your feet. These mansions were monuments to confidence, but confidence is fragile when the landscape keeps changing. And that fragility becomes even clearer when you look at the homes left behind. As new residents moved in, middle-class families, immigrants, newcomers searching for stability, the character of the boulevard changed. Not worse, not better, just different. The echoes of crystal chandeliers and champagne receptions were replaced with the sounds of children playing in hallways, radios humming late at night, meals cooked on stoves that were never built for that many people. The houses adapted to new lives as best they could, but the mismatch between their design and their reality started to show. You can sense that mismatch in the rooms that were sealed off to save on heating costs, or in the ornate fireplaces blocked by makeshift walls, or in the ballrooms cut into cramped apartments with low ceilings. It's hard not to feel a pang of sympathy for both the residents and the structures. The families were doing what they needed to survive. The houses were doing what they could to remain functional. Neither was wrong. Both were struggling against circumstances too big to control. And that's what makes this story so layered. These mansions weren't just victims of economic decline or racial segregation or suburban expansion. They were caught in the crossfire of all of it. They were shaped by ambition, then reshaped by necessity, then reshaped again by collapse. But something interesting happens when a place experiences that many transformations. It stops being just what it was originally built to be. It becomes a kind of archive, of architecture, of culture, of inequality, of resilience. And Millionaire's Row is one of the clearest examples of that transformation in all of American urban history. These houses didn't just witness Detroit's evolution, they absorbed it. And that brings us to a chapter of this story that most people overlook. The individuals who tried, sometimes against impossible odds, to rescue these mansions long before the word revitalization became trendy. Their efforts weren't perfect, and many failed, but their attempts reveal a different side of the boulevard, one filled with determination and hope rather than loss. And it's almost surprising how early some of those attempts began, because even while the city was spiraling through the worst of its challenges, there were always people who refused to let these homes vanish quietly. They weren't wealthy developers or giant organizations. Most of them were individuals, teachers, artists, history buffs, families who simply fell in love with a house that everyone else had written off. Their efforts were messy, inconsistent, sometimes heartbreaking, but they kept the thread of possibility alive when the rest of the world had stopped paying attention. Picture someone in the 1970s or 80s, walking into one of these half-abandoned mansions. There's no heating, barely any electricity, graffiti on the walls, water pooling in the basement. And they think, yes, this is worth saving. That mindset is rare. It's almost a kind of madness, the good kind, the kind that drives people to take on challenges far larger than themselves. Some spent decades restoring their homes one paycheck at a time. Others managed to rescue a single room before the repairs outpaced their means. A few succeeded spectacularly, turning ruins into showpieces. Many quietly failed, overwhelmed by the weight of maintaining a 10,000-square-foot structure built a century earlier with materials and techniques no modern contractor could easily replicate. But even the failures mattered, because every attempt slowed the collapse. Every patched roof, every repaired window, every new coat of paint bought time. Time that kept these homes standing until the city could catch its breath. And it did eventually. But the people who kept these houses alive during the worst decades almost never get mentioned in the larger narrative. It's easy to talk about urban decline in broad strokes, but it's much harder to recognize the small victories that prevented total erasure. And while individuals were fighting their battles, neighborhoods were shifting too. Local organizations formed to advocate for preservation, sometimes operating out of tiny office spaces with barely enough funding to print flyers. They would host walking tours, neighborhood cleanups, preservation campaigns, anything to bring attention back to the boulevard. Their tone was always a mix of optimism and exhaustion, because they believed the area could be saved but knew the city had deeper wounds to tend to first. Still, slowly, something began to change. People outside Detroit started paying attention. Photographers captured the eerie beauty of the decaying mansions. Journalists wrote feature pieces. Historians published books. And with every story that circulated, the narrative shifted just a little more away from hopelessness. The mansions weren't just abandoned relics anymore. They were icons of a powerful, complicated past that people felt drawn to understand. But even as attention grew, the practical challenges didn't magically shrink. The cost of restoring a single mansion could easily reach into the millions. And that's before dealing with issues like asbestos, collapsing foundations, or neighborhoods still struggling with blight. The barrier wasn't just money, it was context. You couldn't save a house without also supporting the environment around it. And that required a kind of long-term vision that Detroit was only beginning to rebuild. Yet surprisingly, the houses themselves became catalysts. They stirred curiosity. They pulled in architects who wanted to experiment. They drew in investors who saw potential not just in nostalgic beauty, but in cultural relevance. And they attracted a generation of Detroiters who grew up surrounded by decay, but saw opportunity instead of defeat. Some restorations were fully realized, turning crumbling mansions into museums, community centers, or private residences that looked like they had stepped out of another century. Others became adaptive reuse projects, boutique inns, art hubs, event spaces, each one proving that the past didn't have to be frozen. It could be reimagined. But many houses remained in limbo. You might walk down the boulevard and see one beautifully restored mansion standing shoulder to shoulder with another that's half collapsed. And that contrast says more about Detroit than any statistic ever could. Revival doesn't happen evenly. It grows in patches, expanding slowly, cautiously, sometimes unpredictably. These mansions became visual evidence of that uneven rebirth. And then, if you look at the bigger picture, you start to see something even more fascinating. The same houses that symbolized Detroit's Gilded Age decline became the anchors of its modern identity. The ruins became part of the city's storytelling power, not as shame, but as testament. Cities are rarely defined by their perfection. They're defined by how they survive imperfection. And Detroit, more than almost any American city, embodies that resilience. But to really understand the emotional grip these mansions hold, you have to explore the deeper truth about why their fate resonates far beyond Michigan. It's not just that they're beautiful or tragic or iconic. It's that they reveal something fundamentally human, how success and collapse can sit right next to each other, how ambition can become legacy or ruin depending on the currents of time. And there's one more layer to this story, a layer tied not to wealth or architecture, but to the way these houses silently documented the shifting dreams of a city. Because long before revitalization began, long before photographers wandered through broken hallways, these mansions had already become something unexpected. Witnesses to all the families, from all walks of life, who lived inside them during the decades of transition.